The assistance, which it had been the emperor's intention to give me, was accordingly only an illusory one. Another year passed without any change being made in the work in the cabinet. I repeated my application to Napoleon to obtain an assistant. What I needed above all was to be relieved of the care of the papers, which had to be classified after having been answered. The multiplicity of my occupations prevented me from keeping these papers in sufficiently good order to be able to find any draft of a letter or a dispatch which the emperor might want to see at a moment's notice. Napoleon avoided satisfying my request for some time longer, either by making promises which he did not keep or in various pretexts. He used to urge me to get married, assuring me that he would arrange my work in such a manner that I should get some rest. Various matches were proposed to me by him and the Empress Josephine, including a lady who was one of her relations, and whom she obliged me to call upon at her house. But at that time I did not feel any vocation for marriage. Besides, I was determined that if I ever did make up my mind to get married, I would choose my own wife. As a matter of fact, more than 2 years passed before I contracted the irrevocable bonds, the solemnity of which so impressed me. Seeing that the emperor put off keeping his promise every day, I became discouraged and fell ill, as much from worry as from overwork. On hearing this news, the emperor showed his solicitude and sent me Dr. Corvisart, who was charged with a kind message. Pending my recovery, he sent for the empress's private secretary. Monsieur Deschamps was one of our most agreeable vaudeville writers. He was still capable of more serious work and a lively and brisk, though past middle life. Napoleon despaired from the very first of being able to accustom him to his way of working, and especially to writing from his dictation. He employed General Duroc, the aide-de-camp on service, and the Secretary of State in turn. During my short illness, I was to some extent in the position of the man who, while yet alive, reads an obituary notice of himself, written by some friendly pen at the news of his death. I heard that when the person to whom the emperor was dictating did not take down his words sufficiently quickly, the emperor would cry out, "I cannot repeat! You make me lose the thread of my thought. Where is Meneval?" Pointing to the disorder on his writing table, he would cry out, "If I had Meneval here, I should soon have cleared all that away." He also used to say that he was postponing all work of importance until after my recovery. As a matter of fact, my entire merit consisted in the acquaintance I had with the connection and direction of Napoleon's affairs, in the way that, thanks to this knowledge, I was able to foresee their development and issue, and in my familiarity with the connection of his ideas, with the precision of his style, and with the originality of his expressions. I did not know any kind of shorthand, and so would have been unable to take down the emperor's words literally, but I used to note down the principal points which served as memoranda, and also the characteristic expressions. I used to rewrite the letters in almost the same terms as he had used, and when he read it over before signing it, which only happened when it was a delicate matter, or one which preoccupied him, he used to find his own style in my writing, if I may use that expression. Those who have followed the details of the work done in the imperial cabinet for sufficient time, or who made themselves acquainted with Napoleon's method of work, have been in a position to verify the truth of what I have related. I confess that my vanity was flattered by the reports which I heard, and the idea that the emperor attached importance to my assistance and my work soon restored me to strength and courage. When I reappeared in his cabinet after 4 days, I may say without boasting that I was received with pleasure. I found Napoleon kinder to me than ever. He authorized me to mention somebody to him as assistant, adding that he left this choice entirely to my personal responsibility. Monsieur Marais, the Duc de Bassano, who used to accompany the emperor on his journeys as Secretary of State, was succeeded by one of his heads of department, with whom I was in relations by reason of my service. I knew him as a man trained to business by the knowledge which his duties at the state secretaryship had given him of the various acts of government. I further knew him to be a very industrious man and honest to a degree. Before approaching him on this subject, I wished to have the opinion of Monsieur Marais, who strongly encouraged me in the idea which I had had of suggesting the name of Monsieur Fane to the Emperor, offering himself as bondsman. I accordingly asked the minister to back up my suggestion in favor of his subordinate. Monsieur Fane was accepted. As far as I was concerned, I was delighted with the arrangement, and as to Monsieur Fane, I never saw a happier man. He embraced me with tears of joy and gratitude. The Emperor promulgated a decree under date of February 3rd, 1806, on the new organization of his cabinet. By the terms of this decree, the service of the imperial cabinet was entrusted to a secretary of the portfolio, assisted by a reporter on petitions and a keeper of archives. I was appointed secretary of the portfolio, and I alone had to present for signature all the notes or letters which the emperor had dictated. I alone had the right to enter into the sovereign's cabinet. I was entrusted with the keeping of the keys of the emperor's writing table and portfolios. If in my absence the emperor dictated any note or letter or had any piece of work done, a copy or at least a draft of this work had to be handed to me immediately on my return. The reporter on petitions was Monsieur Deschamps, already secretary to the Empress Josephine, and Monsieur Fane, who was keeper of the archives. He became later titular secretary to the emperor. Napoleon had wished to do something pleasant for the Empress Josephine and to improve the position of her secretary. The kind-heartedness of this princess and her goodwill towards her people are well known. The emperor, who always loved her tenderly, never refused her anything that he thought it possible to grant. During the first years, the papers connected with affairs which the emperor thought it advisable to withhold from sending to the archives were put into a small mahogany box, which was placed in the cabinet. The key of this box remained in the hands of the secretary of the portfolio. This precaution was only observed for 2 or 3 years, at the end of which all papers, with very few exceptions, were immediately sent off to the archives. The same decree instituted 2 guardians of the portfolio who were in attendance a fortnight in turn. They had to wear a uniform and a sword with a shoulder belt of a peculiar design. I had to wait some time for the assistance which the emperor had intended to grant me in appointing Monsieur Fane. The force of habit, Napoleon's dislike to increase the number of people who shared his confidence, his habit of acting on experience, fortified by a prudence which was increased by the importance and the gravity of the constant struggle in which he was engaged, prevented him at first from entrusting Monsieur Fane's talents and zeal with the employment on which we had counted. It was only gradually, and when the work became too heavy, that he used to call Monsieur Fane into his workroom to dictate to him, after which the secretary used to return to his office of the archives to write out his fair copy. The emperor accustomed himself to him gradually. He first of all employed him for dictations on questions of administration, until the time when the breaking down of my health gave him freer access to the cabinet, which after my retirement was organized on a larger basis. The introduction of Monsieur Deschamps into the cabinet, reorganized by the decree of February 1806, led us to make the acquaintance of a number of his colleagues of the vaudeville, Messieurs Barret, Radet, Desfontaines, Desprez, Picard, and de Vigny, an actor of the Odeon. All people of approved wit and talent. These gentlemen frequently came to luncheon with us. Messieurs Barret, Radet, and Desfontaines were the first to think of the collaboration of several authors in the idea of a theatrical piece in which a unity of plan, idea, and action should be preserved. Monsieur Deschamps obtained for this inseparable trio, who together had founded the vaudeville, a theater on which the glory of France was frequently celebrated in patriotic plays, a pension of 4,000 francs apiece from the funds reserved for the press fund. I am not aware whether the authors continue to enjoy this favor under the government of the Restoration. In the burst of his gratitude, one of the new pensioners cried out, "Oh, vaudeville! heureux d'avoir dans tes domaines des champs. O vaudeville, I am happy to be in your domain, in your field. To which Deschamps, in his modesty, suggested that he should add des prés et des fontaines, and close to the fountains. This anecdote reminds me that a man of letters who had been received at La Malmaison and who had had one of his tragedies played on the court stage obtained a pension of 6,000 francs from the emperor. At the time of the Restoration, this braggart of a poet said, speaking of Napoleon, "The devil of a fellow! As soon as he saw somebody in a crowd whose head topped those of the others, bang! He disgraced them with a pension." Now it happened that the minister who at that time disposed of pensions and pardons reduced the pension of our man of letters to 3,000 francs. In consequence of this, his friends made no haste to congratulate him on the fact that the Restoration had effaced half of his stain. The interest which the emperor took in the prosperity of commerce and industry induced him to visit an establishment which at that time was at its highest prosperity. This was the calico factory which Monsieur Oberkampf had established at Jouet in the Bièvre Valley. Napoleon went there one day in the summer of 1806, accompanied by Josephine and followed by a part of the court. He invested this visit with a certain amount of importance. He went through the various workrooms and examined the various processes of manufacture with attention, desired to be informed of all its details, and even went into the meadow where the calicos were spread out. The emperor expressed his satisfaction to the modest author of this fine establishment. Then, looking at him with greater attention, he showed his surprise at the fact that Monsieur Oberkampf had not yet been decorated with the Legion of Honor. Then, unfastening the cross which he wore in his buttonhole, Napoleon handed it to the manufacturer, saying, "Here is my cross. I am pleased with what I have seen. I like to reward services of all kinds to the motherland. Peaceful war made against the enemy in your workshop is no less efficacious than the war waged on battlefields." During the month of March 1806, orders had been given to the ministers of war and of the war administration to assign the places to be occupied in France by the Corps of the Grande Armée. The garrisons which were to hold were in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 18th, 24th, 25th, and 26th military divisions. The news that the Austrians had handed over to the Russians the mouths of the Catereaux, which by the terms of the Treaty of Pressburg they had promised to surrender to France, suspended the surrender of the fort of Braunau to the Austrian troops, and the movement of the French army took back the Rhine. This incident, which lasted some time, having been terminated by the emperor, confirmed his previous orders for the return home of our army. On the 22nd of June, he sent an order to the Minister of War, fixing the positions which the various corps were to occupy, modifying the first arrangement, although very few of the military divisions which had been named were altered. The major general who had remained in Germany was commissioned with the execution of these orders. The refusal of a ratification of the treaty concluded in Paris with the Russian plenipotentiary du Briel. The rupture of the negotiations begun in Paris with England, and finally the armaments of Prussia called all these orders for the return of the troops to be countermanded. The long stay of the French troops in Germany necessarily formed the pretext for accusations of all kinds against the head of the French government. Libelous pamphlets, which so greatly contributed toward the perversion of public opinion and towards exasperating Europe against France, began to spread and provoked the peoples of Germany to revolt. Booksellers in the principal towns occupied by the French troops printed, published, and hawked these libelous calumnies against us. One of them, Palm, a bookseller at Nuremberg, was arrested, tried by court-martial, and shot. The inflexibility of martial law and the safety of the army rendered this act of rigor imperative. Nevertheless, the effect produced in Germany was terrible, and this occurrence brought down the emperor fresh accusations and a fresh explosion of public indignation. Palm was honored as a martyr of the German national spirit. The major general had respited certain other prisoners who had been sentenced to death for the same crime. He asked the emperor to pardon them, and Napoleon wrote at the bottom of his letter, Saint Cloud, September 4th, 1806. I leave Marshal Berthier free to act as he chooses. I find that the pardons which he asked for me will be granted. The exasperation, however, which regained in Berlin, and the hostile preparations ordered by Prussia increased the anti-French agitation. Prussia, who had learned no lesson from the defeat of Austria and of Russia, nor from the want of success of her bellicose intentions in 1805, entered the area in her turn. This power, whose constant irresolutions worried Napoleon during 5 years, tempted by the French alliance, without definite political system of any kind, but secretly inclining towards the coalition, finished by throwing in her lot against France. The treaty of an offensive and defensive alliance, which had been signed at Vienna by Count Daugwitz after the victory of Austerlitz, ceded Hanover with other important possessions to Prussia in exchange for the Margravate of Ansbach, the Principality of Neuchâtel, and the Duchy of Cleves. Napoleon disposed of the Margravate of Ansbach in favor of Bavaria. It will be remembered that the marching through this territory by Bernadotte's army had furnished Prussia with a pretext to manifest her animosity towards France. The Principality of Neuchâtel was given to Marshal Berthier. The Duchy of Cleves was intended to form part of the Grand Duchy of Berg, to the sovereignty of which Murat was appointed. The balance of these exchanges was immensely in favor of Prussia, whom the emperor, despite his well-founded grievances, wished to bind to him in a close alliance. Count Daugwitz, on his return to Berlin, found the Anglo-Russian spirit predominant in the king's councils, and the king himself engaged to the coalition. The negotiator of the Treaty of Vienna was accordingly blamed, and the king refused his ratification pure and simple, demanding that the alliance with the French Empire should neither be offensive nor defensive, and consenting only to occupy Hanover temporarily until the conclusion of peace between England and France, an event which alone in his eyes could justify Prussia's acquisition of this electorate. Eminently pacific, this monarch wished to combine an apparent friendship for France with the maintenance of close relations with her enemies, a line of conduct which could not possibly satisfy anybody, and which could not fail to make Napoleon lose all confidence in the good faith of Prussia. The emperor, having been apprised of the hostility towards France, which reigned in Prussia, sentiments which the king was powerless to restrain, refused to consider the Prussian ministry as other than a hidden foe. The government, not daring to break off with ours, although it had torn up the Treaty of Vienna, which was so favorable to Prussia, had to accept another treaty, the clauses of which were very much less in her favor. By the terms of the new stipulations, Prussia was forced to accept the fee simple of Hanover, which for fear of offending England she had refused, and to close her harbors against English ships, a clause which involved Prussia in the loss of 400 vessels seized upon by England. The exasperation of France increased after the conclusion of this new treaty, but it was not yet sufficiently strong to break out. The establishment of the Confederation of the Rhine, from which Napoleon looked for the support in Germany, which he did not find in Prussia, brought these hostile feelings, which did not dare to manifest themselves openly, to the highest degree of irritation. As a matter of fact, the Prussian government held France responsible for the loss of the advantages of which it had deprived itself by its continual tergiversations. While France and Prussia were in this equivocal situation, the death of Mr. Pitt made way in the British ministry for Mr. Fox. The new minister took advantage of a peculiar occurrence to approach the French government and to address pacific overtures to France. An exile had proposed the murder of Napoleon to Mr. Fox. Mr. Fox, indignant at such a proposal, had brought it to the emperor's knowledge. A correspondence ensued. Lord Yarmouth, who happened to be in France, where he was detained with the rest of the English travelers who were arrested on French territory at the time of the rupture of the Peace of Amiens, and whose release was obtained by Mr. Fox, acted as intermediary between the two governments. The English cabinet, having expressed the wish to negotiate an agreement with Russia, this proposal was evaded, and it was agreed upon that a Russian agent should be sent direct to Paris. This agent, Monsieur Dubreuil, concluded a separate agreement with France. The negotiation with England was taking a favorable turn. It had been stipulated that she should retain possession of Malta and of the Cape of Good Hope, and should surrender all the other colonies. One of the principal difficulties, the maintenance of King Ferdinand of Sicily, would have been smoothed over, although the union of Malta and Sicily in the hands or under the influence of England had grave disadvantages, because the negotiations were inspired with good faith on both sides. In the course of these negotiations, the French government had even undertaken, apart from the relinquishing of Malta, to consent to restore Hanover to England without consulting Prussia, this power having shown that she attached but little value to this possession. An equivalent and even larger indemnity of the kind likely to be agreeable to Prussia had been stipulated for, it being proposed to give Prussia Fulda, Hoya, and some other principalities in exchange. Napoleon had undertaken to secure Prussia's consent to these arrangements. Peace was just going to be signed when Fox fell dangerously ill and died a short time after. Lord Yarmouth was at once replaced by Lord Lauderdale, who was sent by the war party in London, who had conceived the hope of forming another coalition against us, with the mission to break off negotiations. Lord Lauderdale, in consequence, imperiously demanded, in the place of the terms agreed upon with Lord Yarmouth, that each country should retain its respective possessions, with the exception of Hanover, which is occupied by Prussia, a proposal which amounted to this, that England would have kept all her conquests, and that neither Prussia nor France would have obtained any compensation from the British ministry. Since the only English possession on the continent which these powers had in their hand was Hanover, it was evident that peace was not desired in London, that all that was wanted to obtain a declaration from France that Hanover should be restored to England, a declaration which would have rendered all reconciliation with Prussia out of the question. At the same time, the Emperor of Russia refused to ratify the treaty concluded in Paris by Monsieur Dubreuil. Lord Lauderdale demanded the return of his letters of credence.